Today we're delighted to welcome back Harvey Miller. Harvey is the Bob and Mary Reusche Chair of Geographic Information Sciences. He's also a professor of geography, and he's also the director of CURA, the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis. So let's welcome him back.
Okay. Thank you, John. Woo! I appreciate that woo, whoever did that. Okay, here we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Harvey Miller from the Department of Geography, Center for Urban and Regional Analysis here in the Arts and Science College at OSU. I'm going to talk to you today about a big project we have going on in CURA. We're using artificial intelligence and geographic information science to build virtual worlds from old maps. Now, our project is part of this revolution that's going on in urban science and urban historical research. It's the so-called soft data revolution. There is a wealth of unstructured or soft data locked in historical documents. Data that cannot be easily accessed, organized, or used for data analytics. Things such as city directories, real estate deeds, tax records, newspapers, old maps in our case. In the past, these documents were filed away in cabinets and boxes, in attics and basements and in warehouses. Increasingly, they're being scanned and digitized and saved as digital documents for both archival and research purposes. And when things are in digital form, they can be processed by computer. And this is opening a whole new world into the past and what cities were like in the past and how they evolved over time. So let me give you a couple examples of some urban soft data projects that are going on outside of Ohio State. This is from the University of Minnesota, and it's a project called Mapping Prejudice. And what they're doing is they're tapping into a database of digital scans of property deeds in the Twin Cities region of Minnesota over several decades. And they're using software tools to crowdsource the identification of racial covenants within these property deeds. And once they identify one of these property deeds with the racial covenant, they then georeference it based on its street address. This enabled them to be able to georeference thousands and thousands of deeds with racial covenants and create things like this heat map you saw evolving on the screen, showing the growth of these over time in the Twin Cities area. Another example, this is a research center that's devoted to soft urban data. It's called the Center for the Restoration of Economic Data, or CREED. And it's at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank. And what they're doing is using machine learning and AI to tap into scanned documents and create structured databases that allow econometric analysis. So I was lucky enough to be invited to a symposium in 2024 to celebrate the first anniversary of CREED. They invited me to come and share some of the work I'm going to share with you this afternoon. But I saw some absolutely amazing research going on there. For example, they're studying historic housing prices in the United States by looking at the real estate section of newspapers in 30 cities going back a century or so. They're looking at the spread of driving across the United States by processing these large State Department of Transportation tables showing the spread of driver's license registrations at the county level across the 20th century. They are studying the impact of zoning in the United States by scanning and processing all of the all of the zoning code documents for the United States at once. So it's really amazing. The era of being able to tap into this digital treasure trove of scanned documents is here, and it's changing how we approach cities and how we approach urban history. So I'm going to talk to you today about a soft urban data project we have going on in CURA here at The Ohio State University, the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, which I'm lucky to direct. CURA is the hub for OSU for geospatial data science applied to cities, with the objective of making more sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities in Ohio and beyond. Founded in 2001, CURA supports Ohio State's mission to be the model 21st century land-grant research, urban, and community-engaged institution of higher education in the country. In this project, we're using AI and Geographic Information Science to create virtual worlds, or ghost neighborhoods, from old maps. In this project, we're doing digital reconstructions of past neighborhoods using historical Sanborn Fire Insurance maps, which I'll show you in just a few moments. We're using AI, GIS, and 3D modeling. And we're doing our work in Columbus, but it has importance beyond Columbus. These Sanborn fire maps, I'm going to show you in just a moment or two, exist for 12,000 cities and towns around the country from the period 1880s through the 1960s. So the techniques we're developing here in Columbus can be applied nationwide to create 3D models, detailed virtual models of cities going back to the 19th century. We're doing this to create deep experiences of history, to visualize history in the form of websites, immersive displays, VR and AR. And we also want to generate high-resolution historical urban morphology data to be able to study cities historically and as they evolved over time at a fine level of detail. So we're doing this for historical discovery and also storytelling about the past lived experiences in these neighborhoods. And we also want to enable new novel science, urban science on urban morphology, how it evolved over time and how it associates with things such as social, economic, and environmental outcomes in cities. So here is a Sanborn Fire Insurance map. These were published as bound volumes for cities. You could see this one is for Everett, Massachusetts in 1910. You could see that it was probably stored in a damp basement somewhere because it suffered some ravages of time. So increasingly what's happening is that libraries such as Ohio State Library, Columbus Metropolitan Library, other libraries around the country, university and city libraries are making these Sanborn maps available in digital form. But in particular, we're tapping into this collection, the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has this project to take all the Sanborn maps when they come out of copyright and scan them and make available as high-resolution digital scans. Right now, their collection comprises about 50,000 volumes and about 700,000 individual map sheets. This is the treasure trove of digital map data that we're tapping into for this project. So here's an example of a Sanborn Fire Insurance map. It's a zoom in of a map sheet on the east side of Columbus in 1961. You can see the map legend. So here's the map right here. This is just part of the map sheet. And here's the legend. This is just part of the legend. There's so much data encoded into these maps that the legends can go on for pages. These Sanborn maps were published and updated at irregular intervals. It just depended upon when there was enough change in the city to justify it, that they could sell the new volume or corrections to the volume to the city. In Columbus, we have Sanborn map data for 1887, 1891, 1901, 1921 through 1922, 1940, 1951, and 1961. Now I want to give you a sense of the rich building by building information that's encoded into these maps. So let's look at this simple example. This is Mount Vernon Avenue in Columbus in 1951. It's a simple little street right here. So what can we tell from this Sanborn map about this neighborhood in 1951? Well, first of all, we can see the building footprints, very detailed building footprints here. We can see the property lines and parcels, and we can also see the street addresses of the buildings. Street addresses are really important because with street addresses, we can link this building data to other address indexed data, such as city directories, which used to list the residents and businesses in every building in a city as a bound volume. It would list it by street address rather than by name and number. So those also exist in digital form. We can tap into that to see who was living in the houses and what businesses were there. We can also see that the building usage. This building over here is retail because it was marked for S, which meant store. That building up there is a garage because it was marked A for auto. And these buildings right here are single-family dwellings, marked D for dwellings. If they wanted to indicate a multifamily dwelling, they would mark it F for flat or apartment. And these buildings were made of wood, which is indicated in yellow. They're made of made of concrete, indicated by blue. They're not made of blue. And brick, they're also made of brick, indicated by the red color. And some of them, of course, have composite materials or made of multiple materials. Some of these places here have like brick homes with wood front and back porches. We could see that the buildings are 1 and 2 stories high in parts. That's indicated by a number there encoded in the footprint of each building. In this case, we have houses that are 2 stories high with a 1-story porch in front. And we could see that this building here, over here on the left, has a composite roof, shingle roof. This brick building here on this side of the building has windows on the first and second floor, and these townhomes have firewalls that extend 12 inches above the roof. Anything that had to do with fire risk, fire vulnerability, fire liability were encoded into the buildings here on these maps. Now, that was a simple example. These buildings and these maps get really complicated very quickly. Here is Mount Vernon Avenue, 1951, one of our study areas, and you could see that the density of the building level detail that's encoded using symbology, text, and color. I want to pause for a second and have us all show a little respect for these cartographers. Nowadays, we have it easy. If I want to create a map, I can put all the data into a geospatial database on my computer, and then I can produce any map I want, just through a few buttons on my GIS software. Back then, there was no separate computer database. Back then, the map was the database. So anything you want to save and store and communicate about on a map, you had to encode directly into the map itself as symbology, text, numbers, and color. Also keep in mind that every single line, letter, word, number, symbol on that map was hand-etched, was hand-drawn. Imagine a big room with big sheets coated with a coating, metallic coating, and people bent over with scribing material, with jeweler's eyepieces, scratching every one of those lines into a negative to produce the map, using lettering kits to make sure those letters are uniform. And they scratched this, created a big negative of the map, then produced the map in black and white, printed it using that negative, and then all the maps were hand-colored. And they produce a lot of these, hundreds and thousands around the country. So I like to tell my GIS students that, much as they whine about our lab assignments, they have it easy compared to how things were before computers came along. Now at present, we're just scratching the surface of these really incredibly detailed, very rich maps. We're looking at things such as building footprints, building utilization, number of stories, and the construction material. But as time goes on, we're digging deeper and deeper into these very rich maps about cities. I want to give you a sense of the scale and scope of these maps. So here's a present-day aerial view of downtown Columbus. And here are the Sanborn maps covering downtown Columbus. And as you can see, this is from 1951. And you can see that takes dozens and dozens of map sheets to cover even a small-sized downtown like Columbus in 1951, because each map sheet has building-by-building detail. Here is a partial collection of the 1951 map sheets for Columbus on top of a current-day satellite image. This is not a complete collection, but just as far as we've gotten so far. And if you look, you can see up there, yes it is, Ohio State University. And you could see on this map what Ohio State looked like in 1951, its campus, including the shoe before they added all that other stuff to it. So, lots of historical information in these maps with extensive coverage for any city and cities all around the country. What are we doing about that? Well, I'm going to get just a little geeky, only briefly and only a little geeky, just to describe our methods at a very high level. The very first thing we have to do is take each Sanborn digital map sheet and we have to georeference it, which means we have to place it in modern map coordinates so we know where it is on the surface of the Earth. Then what we do is we use a form of machine learning, which is a form of artificial intelligence, and we do a pixel by pixel classification of all the colors in that map. For those of you who are geeky out there, we use a machine learning technique called support vector machines, which is a really good technique for detecting patterns in imagery. And what we do, it's a form of supervised machine learning. It means that we go through the map and we take a sample map and we hand label, like this is a red pixel, this is a yellow pixel, this is a blue pixel, this is a background or tan pixel. And we do that for one map sheet and we train the computer to learn against that, to train against that sample map sheet. And when it gets it right, fantastic. When it gets the pixel color right, when it gets it wrong, basically the algorithm sends it a signal that has to update its parameters or correct its beliefs. And then after a while, it converges quite quickly to learn the pattern, the color pattern in the map. And then once it's trained, we can set it against the rest of the atlas. And it's be able to predict the pixel colors at very high accuracy. Once we do that, we pipe it into a Geographic Information System software. And then we have to clean up some of the noise, correct some crooked walls and things like that, and then we create spatial building footprint objects in the GIS. And this is showing the similar process where we detect building utilizations and number of stories. If you look very closely there, you can see the symbols like D and 1 and 2. You can see D there is surrounded by a red box. That means the computer recognized that as a symbol for the utilization of what's going on in that building. Saying that, and the green boxes indicate 1 or 2 stories, the number of stories in each part of the building. That means the computer has detected that as a symbol indicating the number of stories. And if you look very closely, you can see these little white numbers here. That's showing what it detected and its degree of confidence in that detection of that symbol. Now moving on, what we do is once we've piped all this data into a GIS and cleaned it up and created these spatial footprint objects, we then pipe it into another GIS called City Engine. City Engine has a language called computer-generated architecture that allows us to generate detailed 3D models of buildings based on that input data. CGA is a language like any other language, so you can actually write and code in it, and you can specify things like the number of stories, the pitch of the roof, the windows, the size, the doors, the chimneys, everything. This allows us to specify the detailed configuration of the building in 3D. Now, right now, this is very much a manual process. We have to go through and build each building by hand, one by one. That's a very slow process, a very tedious process, and one of the things we're doing, which I'll mention at the end of my talk, is that we're trying to accelerate that technique to make this modeling part automated, just like the extraction of data off the maps. Now, when we first developed our techniques, we first just created abstract buildings, just 3-dimensional extrusions of the footprint polygons, which didn't really look like buildings. They were just like 3-dimensional weird polygons. Then we started building in realistic rules for how buildings look like, and we started to get realistic buildings. But in our third and current generation, what we're doing is we're generating historically accurate buildings by using the Sanborn data and other data such as historical photographs, aerial images from the time, and also in some cases architectural blueprints, which we have available. Okay. So that ends the geeky part of the talk, and now I'll pivot back to what we're doing here in Columbus. So back in 2020, when we first started to develop these techniques and said, let's give it a try, let's try to pull the data off the maps and create these 3D models of neighborhoods, almost exactly that week, like literally almost a week that we were starting to work on this, this article was published back in December 2020 in the Columbus Dispatch, How Highways Destroyed Black Neighborhoods in the 1960s, as told by the elders who were there. It's a very good article. It's still on the Dispatch website. I really recommend looking it up and reading it and listen to some of the videos of elders talking about what happened, what the neighborhood was like, and what it was like during the construction and afterwards. So I said to my group at CURA, I said, why don't we do these neighborhoods? I mean, in addition to being a geospatial data geek, I am also a transportation geographer, and I've done some research on urban highways and their effects on cities. And I thought this would be a very good way to kind of focus our technical efforts into something empirical and valuable locally. The stories of what happened to these historical black buildings because of urban highway construction I think are very important stories. They are American stories. They're part of our history. They are stories that remind us of the differential benefits and cost of projects like highways. Some people benefit, but other people pay the cost. But there's also a positive message here. It's a reminder of what used to exist and still persists in these neighborhoods, which is community and a sense of heritage and shared culture. So here are the 3 study sites so far for the ghost neighborhoods of Columbus. We're going to be expanding to other neighborhoods in the near future. One neighborhood, one study site is Hanford Village in 1961. This was once a separate village, just like Bexley is today. It was eventually absorbed into the city of Columbus in 1955. Today it's known as the Driving Park neighborhood. We're going to show, we have a model of this in 1961 before I-70 came through, and with particular focus on this called the George Washington Carver edition, something I'll talk about in just a moment or two. Second study site, up here you can see on the map, this is the Near East side of Columbus, Poindexter Village. In 1940 when it opened, this was the first public housing community in Ohio, the second in the United States. And this is going to be the site of a new African American History and Cultural Museum that's opening in 2028, being opened by the Ohio History Connection. And we're partnering with the Ohio History Connection to make these 3D models part of the museum experience. Our third study site so far is nearby Mount Vernon Avenue in 1951. This was a strip of black-owned businesses. At the time, it was known as the Black Downtown. And we're modeling it in 1951 when it was at its commercial height, before there was depopulation, disinvestment in this neighborhood, and before I-71 came through and isolated it from downtown Columbus. So let's look at the first one. Hanford Village, as I said, was a separate village, just like Bexley still is today, but Hanford Village was created in 1909, and it became majority African American during the Great Migration of black people from the South in the 20th century. It was eventually annexed by the city of Columbus in 1955. The George Washington Carver edition of Hanford was established in 1946 to meet the post-war housing boom for returning African American veterans from World War II. Many of the original homeowners in the George Washington Carver edition were Tuskegee Airmen, who after World War II were stationed at nearby Lockbourne Army Air Base. Now we call it Rickenbacker. And this is on the Carver edition is on the National Registry of Historic Places. During the 1960s, the construction of I-70 split Hanford Village in two and took out a portion of the George Washington Carver edition. So here is our 3D model we built from the Sanborn data of Hanford Village as it looked in 1961, and it has present-day I-70 superimposed on it. The red buildings are the buildings that no longer exist, and most of them were taken out to construct I-70, but also a nearby freeway interchange and Elm Creek Drive. Now, we modeled most of this neighborhood at a low resolution and focused the detail on the George Washington Carver edition, which is right there. We could zoom in and take a look at this. These were houses that were developed in 1946, Cape Cod-style housing. There was new houses, which meant that the African-American veterans who were coming back from World War II could take advantage of the GI Bill, which only provided support for mortgages for new housing, not for existing housing. So again, many of the original homeowners were Tuskegee Airmen. And some of these veterans who were enjoying homeownership for the first time in their lives were in these houses for 5 or 6 years and were told, sorry, you have to get out, the highway's coming through. Particularly sad story here in Columbus, but it's actually a very typical American story when it came to urban highway construction in the mid to late 20th century. And again, the red buildings are the ones that no longer exist, the ones that mostly were taken out to construct I-70 in the nearby freeway interchange. Second study site, Poindexter Village in 1940. This was the first public housing community in Ohio, the second in the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came from Washington, D.C. to Columbus for its dedication. Let's pause and reflect upon a time when a U.S. president would come to a city to dedicate public housing. Poindexter Village was named for James Preston Poindexter. He was an abolitionist and Baptist minister in Columbus, and he was also the first black person on Columbus City Council and the first on the city's Board of Education. The community was a nurturing place for the first few decades. This is based on the stories we've heard. We've talked to people, we've interviewed them, and they've told us that it was a very nurturing place. It uplifted families out of poverty. It was a real sense of community. Later years, of course, with the cumulative effects of redlining, disinvestment, effective urban highways, depopulation, disinvestment, eventually vacancies piled up, and eventually calls came to tear it down. In 2013, the Columbus Metropolitan Authority tore down 33 of the 35 buildings. They preserved 2 for historical preservation purposes. And in 2017, the Ohio History Connection purchased the 2 remaining buildings to create the new Poindexter Village African American Museum, which will be opening in 2028. And again, CURA is very proud to be partnering with Ohio History Connection to make these 3D models part of the museum experience. So here's our architect's rendering of what Poindexter Village would look like in 1940 when it was built. Here is the current day image of the site. It's between Mount Vernon Avenue and Long Street, and Champion is the north-south street, just to place it in your mental map of Columbus. And here's our model of what it looked like in 1940 when it was built. As you can see, this was a very expansive public housing community. It had apartments of different sizes and configuration depending upon household need. It also had an administration building, a heating plant, and a school. And I'll zoom in here to show you a little more detail. This is the Union Grove Baptist Church. This predates Poindexter Village, and it's still standing today. Here's the administration building, power plant. Here's the high school. These two buildings are the only two buildings that are still standing. And those are the two buildings where the African American History and Culture Museum will be opening in 2028. I also love to point out that every tree in this model was a tree that was there in the 1940s. We went to the Ohio Department of Transportation. They maintain, in the past, they still do this today, they do aerial photographs, high resolution aerial photographs for mapping purposes. They have, thankfully, again, urban soft data, they keep all their digital copies of these aerial photographs at their website. You can download them and use them. And we found an aerial image for Poindexter Village in 1946. And everywhere we saw a tree, we planted a tree in the model. So even the trees are accurate. Third study site is Mount Vernon Avenue in 1951. Again, this was the commercial heart of the Black community. We're partnering with the Ohio History Connection on this and with the Columbus Landmarks Foundation, who was pursuing historic district designation for Mount Vernon Avenue. And we also had support from the Betha Endowment here at Ohio State University to build this model in particular. And Poindexter Village was near, Mount Vernon Avenue was right near Poindexter Village. It was kind of the main street for the entire neighborhood, including Poindexter Village. So here's what it looks like today, aerial image. Here is Mount Vernon Avenue right here. Here's I-70, which cut it off from downtown. Notice they had to divert Mount Vernon Avenue down to Long Street. Mount Vernon Avenue picks up again right there. This is where Columbus State Community College currently exists. I'm part of what used to be Mount Vernon Avenue. These are the fused and georeferenced Sanborn maps. And if you look there, you could see that the urban fabric back there in 1951 was very, very different than what we see today. And zooming in, this is our study site. This was the commercial heart right there of Mount Vernon Avenue. Very lively business district at the time in 1951. Again, with the effects of disinvestment, effects of redlining, urban highways, depopulation, sprawl because of urban highways. This area began to depopulate and eventually went into decline. And then in the late 70s, in an urban renewal project, they bulldozed the entire north part of our study area and erased all the historical buildings and also erased 3 complete streets. Streets were just wiped out, and they created this public housing project here. Okay, so in this case, we wanted to make sure that we created an experience of what it was like to be on Mount Vernon Avenue in 1951. So we wanted to make sure we got the storefronts correctly and the signs, so we really had an experience of what it was like to be on the street in 1951. So we hired a PhD student in history who did a lot of archival research. She did work at the Columbus Metropolitan Library. She went to the Ohio History Connection and dug into their archive. And anywhere she found a photograph of Mount Vernon Avenue in the early 1950s, she captured it, and we used it. We studied the photographs to build these 3D models of buildings corresponding to what we saw in the photograph. And she was very creative at finding photos. In one case, she found this book that just happened to have a photo of Mount Vernon Avenue in 1950s, and we just used that to recreate some of the storefronts. Okay, so here is Mount Vernon Avenue today. Here's Mount Vernon Avenue. Here's the north part of the street that was bulldozed in 1978 to create this public housing project. Here's the south side of the street. You could see that some of the commercial buildings, the historic buildings, are still there, but a lot of them have been torn down to build things such as parking lots. And here's what it looked like in 1951. Now again, we did most of the neighborhood at fairly low resolution, the residential houses and so forth, and we focused most of our attention on Mount Vernon Avenue itself and provided a lot of detail for the storefronts there. So let's show you some street scenes here. You could see the storefronts. You also can see people on the street. You could see telephone poles and trees. You could see cars and trolley buses. We did that because when we first created this model and then went to elders in the neighborhood to remember Mount Vernon Avenue, they said to us, yeah, you got the stores right, but it's too dead on the street. This was a lively, vibrant place. There was always a lot of traffic, people on the streets and so forth. So we added all this other stuff, the street hardware, the cars and the people on the street, in order to make it seem like a much more dynamic and lively place and much more authentic to people's memories of what Mount Vernon was like in 1951. Now that's a good segue into talking about the outreach and engagement we've done in this project. When we decided to do this project focusing on historically black neighborhoods in Columbus before urban highways and urban renewal, we made a decided effort, a conscious decision to do this in a community engaged way. We wanted to make sure that our models were authentic, that people who have memories of these neighborhoods say, yes, that's what it looked like. We also wanted to make sure that we were doing something that was beneficial to the communities. We wanted to explore different use cases, how these models could be used, what people thought would be the value of these models. As much as possible, we wanted to co-design the models with the community to tell us where to put in detail, tell us what's important, tell us what you think of our designs, tell us of the different ways, tell us how we're delivering it, and just really get feedback the whole way through and try to get as much as possible from people in the neighborhood, especially people who have direct memories of these neighborhoods. And we also collected stories and photos. We interviewed a lot of elders who used to live in the neighborhood and remember what it was like before the highways and after the highways and during the construction. And we've collected those, and that will be integrated into our models to make our models a platform for storytelling, not just 3D models of a neighborhood. So I'll show you just some short examples, some small examples of, we did a lot of outreach activities, a lot of community engagement. I'll just give you a little sample of this. This is from March 2024. We were invited to give a talk at the Driving Park branch of the Columbus Metropolitan Libraries. It was an invited community conversation, so we spoke there in an evening on March 2024. And luckily, students from the nearby Rickenbacker Woods Foundation actually came to our talk after school in order to learn more about this neighborhood and what we were doing. We also engaged with the local historical preservation community. This is the Preserving Columbus Conference, which happens every year. It's run by the Columbus Landmarks Foundation. And we also have presented at statewide historical preservation conferences like the Ohio Heritage Conference that happens every year. And we wanted to make sure that we were, again, being authentic here. We connected to local professional knowledge as well, besides community and neighborhood knowledge. But we also wanted to make sure that our models could be a positive force in trying to preserve more of our historical legacy here in Columbus and beyond. Our most rewarding, I think, engagements were at community events. So we actually went to the community when they had events such as Juneteenth Jubilee. They do this every year. We've been going to it regularly. Juneteenth Jubilee happens on Mount Vernon Avenue, right at our study site. And we set up a table there. We have lots of brochures and maps and posters. And we brought tablet computers with our models so people could actually look at them. We actually gamified it, so we created a little roulette wheel so people would interact with our models that had different Mount Vernon Avenue businesses on it, and you'd spin the wheel and it'd land on a business, and then you had to try to find it on one of our tablet computers. And if you found it, and everyone always did, if you found it, you get a little prize with a little fact sheet telling a story about that building in 1951. Really incredible, especially younger people. This Juneteenth Jubilee happens right at our study site, so allows especially young people come look at our models and say, that was here? And it's like, yes, that's what this neighborhood was like 70 years ago, before the highways came through and before, the decline we see today. We've also done some engaged community events with arts groups. In this case, this is something called Bronzeville Universe. It was a workshop that was developed by a guy named Marshall Shorts, who runs the Artfluential Arts Collective on the near east side of Columbus. And he had a community workshop, which he called Bronzeville Universe, and he wanted to ask people in the community the question, what if Bronzeville, which is the near east side of Columbus, had been allowed to thrive? What if it didn't go through what it went through, instead had been allowed to thrive like other neighborhoods? And knowing this, what futures for this neighborhood can we imagine together? So we went to this workshop, we set up our tablet computers, we explored what we think how this could fit into, how our project could fit into this future visioning for the community. And we also set up an analog way of people to give us comments on our models and show us where they want to us to do work next, what buildings they thought were important, what we thought we got right, what we got wrong, so they could post little stickers on there saying, do this building next, and also little sticky notes to say, no, you got the face of that building wrong, you need to look into this. And as I mentioned, our big partner in the community on this has been the Ohio History Connection. We've been doing a lot of events with them. This was the official launch of the Poindexter Village Museum in December 2024. And we went to an event. This is at Union Grove Baptist Church at the Poindexter Village site. And we talked about our project, what we're doing, our models, and let people know this is going to be part of the museum experience. And this was the first event when we trotted out a VR experience of our models. So we're working with the Sharp Field Library at the Department of Geography. The Sharp Field Library is a collection of equipment and technology and expertise for doing field-based research and education, generously supported by Gary Sharp, who is an alumnus of the Department of Geography. And they had some VR technology and they had some expertise. So we teamed up with them for this event and created a VR Poindexter Village. And we were just testing it out. We put on the goggles and thought it looked pretty cool. We wanted to see what people would feel like when we went to this event and let people in the community who had direct knowledge and memory of Poindexter Village see what their reaction would be. And the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. In fact, really strong emotional, positive responses to this. Some people who had memories, direct memories of Poindexter Village were seeing it in its full extent for the first time in decades. And they were very, very positive. So we have accelerated our VR development and VR experiences for this project. This is from last summer. We went to the Juneteenth Jubilee run by the Ohio History Connection at their site. This was a very family-friendly event, and we brought the VR goggle. We had VR goggles for all 3 study sites, and the kids loved it. It was super popular among children. As you can see in the lower right corner, here's a child operating the VR goggle. I love working with children with VR because they get it right away. It's like, you just give them like 15 seconds of instruction or like, out of the way, old man, I got this. And they can interact with it. You adults, that's a little more difficult. You guys require a lot of instruction. But what she's doing here, you can see what she's doing with her hands. And I wish I'll talk about why I didn't bring VR goggles in just a moment today. Don't want to disappoint you. But basically, you put on these goggles and it's an immersive experience. You're floating above one of our study sites. In this case, the George Washington Carver edition. You can look around, look up at the sky, and look all around at the model, just floating above it. And then if you want to jump to different views, you can either pick a street level view in one of these circles here, or if you want an aerial view, a different one, you go to one of these blue trumpets, and what you do is you just, you just point at it and then pinch to select it. A very simple operation. This allows you to jump around, see different sites of all 3 study areas. Sorry, didn't bring the goggles today. These goggles are still cumbersome. They require a lot of energy. The batteries are big. They drain quickly. But that's just current day VR technology. 5 years from now, we'll start to see them more like ski goggles or even glasses. And these VR experiences will be much more accessible to a wider audience of people. Now, we've also tried to look for other ways to share our model. And one of the ways we're trying to do this is through using 3D models as a platform for storytelling. So we're using 2 other GIS softwares, one called Story Maps, another called Experience Builder, that allows us to bring in other media, photographs, documents, interviews with elders, and incorporate into these 3D models so they could serve as a platform for storytelling. So for example, in that one, that one's not live yet, the Ghost Neighborhoods one. It's in development. We're going to be releasing it publicly in early 2026. But as you scroll through there, you get to the part on Poindexter Village, and as you keep scrolling, what happens is that as you're reading about the different types of buildings that were in Poindexter Village, it automatically navigates to one of those buildings in our model. And you can read about like different types of apartments and different buildings they had there and actually see it visualized as you tour our model. Just a couple more. There were 7 different types of building configurations depending on the household need and size. And also we created views of the administration building and the power plant and of course Union Grove Baptist Church. Now for Mount Vernon Avenue, we're using a different software. Again, this will be published in early 2026. You'll be able to explore it on your own. But we used a software called Experience Builder. It's a GIS software that allows you to do self-guided tours of 3D models. So here is our Mount Vernon Avenue model, and here's a bunch of businesses along the bottom. And if you're interested in, let's say I want to learn about Lee's Style Shop, I'll click on that photograph there, and it'll navigate to that in our model. And if I want to know what that was, I click on a little button, and a little description of it comes up. I want to do a deeper dive, I click that button, and it goes to another page, and you could see all photographs, stories, newspaper articles, videos of interviews with people talking about what it was like, how that store figured into their lives and their experiences and memories of it. We're also exploring other ways of sharing our work. So in this case, we're working with a gentleman, Azubuike Azubuike, and he's opening pretty soon in the first quarter of 2026. He's opening a new grocery gallery on Mount Vernon Avenue. And we connected with Azubuike through a mutual connection. And we said, well, maybe we can create a video or animation to help celebrate the new store, but also promote our project and promote the Poindexter Village Museum. So we piped our 3D model into Unity, which is a software for doing 3D animation for television, for gaming, and for other media. And we created this video, which I'm going to show you right now. Now, the music fans in the audience may recognize the music of Nancy Wilson. She was a jazz and blues singer, a self-styled song stylist. That's how she referred to herself. She was born in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1937 and attended West High School in Columbus. She played at the clubs on the east and north side of Columbus at the time before moving to New York City. She eventually had a 50-year music career where she recorded 70 albums and won 3 Grammys. And when the students developed that video, I said, why don't we get some music to make it a little more lively? And I described Nancy Wilson to the students, and they went and found that really excellent song that really makes that video pop, in my opinion. Okay, great. Just wrapping up now. What are we doing right now? Where are we going with this? Well, our current research is focused on accelerating our model development so we can automate more of it and make it much more scalable, meaning we can do much larger neighborhoods and even entire cities. Our goal is to reduce the development time by an order of magnitude by times 10, which is a lofty goal, but we have some good ideas on how to do it. For example, the Mount Vernon Avenue model I showed you took 700 hours to develop. Most of it was to build the buildings. So we've automated the extraction of the data off the maps, but we haven't automated the construction of the 3D buildings, and that's what we're working on right now. And I'm very pleased to tell you that we just got an award from the National Science Foundation to accelerate our techniques. So check back in a couple years, and I think we'll be able to produce something like Mount Vernon Avenue in 70 hours rather than 700, which means that we'd be able to do much bigger neighborhoods, even do entire cities, and also make these techniques more transferable to other places. We're doing this in order to deepen our community engage co-design, make our feedback process more interactive and on the fly with people we're working with in the community. We also want to enable novel urban science by generating urban morphological data for entire cities to study the fine-grained development of cities over history and how they associate with environmental, economic, and social outcomes. And we're also exploring new applications such as classifying industrial buildings and doing economic base modeling of neighborhoods going back all the way to the 19th century, integrating other soft data such as documents, city directories, and other imagery, and automate the generation of building texture using generative AI. And that's what we're working on right now. Okay, I am going to leave it there. I just want to acknowledge a lot of people worked on this project. It's not just me. It takes a village to build a neighborhood. This includes my staff at CURA. We've hired students both at the undergraduate and graduate level from a variety of fields: geography, GIS, air transportation, civil engineering, history. We also have OSU collaborators, Matthew Lewis, who's in the Department of Design and ACAD, and Josh Savari. He's our very capable geospatial librarian here at Ohio State. I also want to recognize Shelby Toon, who's our best friend in the community, who's the project manager for Poindexter Village, for the museum that's opening up in 2028. And some of the people, the emeriti like to say, people who worked on this project are no longer at CURA, but still made really important contributions. Again, we have funding from the National Science Foundation to continue our technological and scientific development. I'd like to acknowledge funding from the Betha Endowment to do the Mount Vernon Avenue model, and also the Arts and Science College at Ohio State that supports this project by supporting CURA. We have technical support from the Sharp Field Library for our VR efforts, and our main community partners, I should acknowledge, are Columbus Landmarks Foundation, the James Preston Poindexter Foundation, and of course, Ohio History Connection. You want to check out the models, there's a QR code. It'll take you to a web page. It describes the project. It also has links to some of the media attention. We've received media attention across the United States as word of our project got out, and people from all around the country, historians, city planners. I heard from the director of history of Phoenix, Arizona. Who knew? Phoenix, Arizona has a director of history, but they want to know when we could do work in their cities. And after we get our techniques accelerated and can apply it more widely, we're going to be looking at doing this work elsewhere around the country. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for being here and listening.
Okay, maybe we could bring up the house lights a little bit. And usually we open the floor to questions.
It's about zone in and looking forward and what's happening now with zoning reform. Yes, actually, I think that's an important message that this research can inform. People don't appreciate that the way cities look nowadays in the 21st century, and even in the latter half of the 20th century, were not the way cities looked at for most of their history. Most of the neighborhoods in central Columbus were 3 to 5 times denser in terms of population than they are right now. So this is something that can help people appreciate the fact that we're trying to create more dense development, because that's the way cities naturally are, very dense in terms of their development. One thing we have to be cautious of is that we're not necessarily going to get back the history we saw before. That nowadays development's a little bit different. You see, for example, a lot of apartments, 5/1s they call them, and 6/1s, where you have, 5 stories of residential apartments with commercial on the ground floor. That's kind of more typical of the development nowadays than the development back then. We have more capital now, more technology, and we can build housing a little bit better. That doesn't mean we shouldn't respect the historic urban fabric, and we should recognize that we can repopulate these neighborhoods to a much higher level than they are right now. But we also have to recognize that we're not necessarily going to go back to the way cities looked in the past.
Let's see. It's hard for me to see questions. Wave your hand. Go ahead, Young.
So is there any push to model, so as you said, you might be using the technology moving forward. Is there a software integration or something you could integrate to the software or are working to integrate that would figure out population, estimated population densities and general logistics?
Right, no, that's a very good question. In fact, yes, we can by integrating this with other data. For example, there's a project, again, I'm going to mention University of Minnesota, there's a project called the National Historic GIS, and they have all the census data going back to the first census, geo-referenced, mapped at the individual level. And now there's a privacy, so we only can access data going back to the 1930s. Beyond that, there's a privacy concern about accessing these files, but after a certain time period, you can access these files directly, and you can know exactly where people lived. There's also, so census data is one source to do what you're saying. I also mentioned city directories. City directories are like, anyone remember phone books? You're probably too young to remember a phone book. But like a phone book, we have someone's name and phone number and then their address. A city directory is like a phone book, except it lists everything by address. So it'll give you a street, it'll give you all the addresses and tell you who lived there, or if there was a business, what the business was. And that's another way that we can get historical information about population density. So yes, you're right, we can combine this building data we're creating with things like city directories, old census data, and we can get fine-grained population estimates. That's exactly correct.
I think a hint I heard in the last 2 questions, maybe I'll try to amplify it. Thinking ahead towards developing the city, suppose we have plan A, plan B, and plan C for how that might go. Could software like yours simulate those different futures and give people an idea of testing out what different futures might look like?
Oh, that's possible already, actually. There is a software, again, another GIS software called Esri Urban. Esri's the name of the company, and they do 3D modeling. And this is meant not for historic purposes, this is meant for perspective purposes. So for example, if someone's going to build a building, you can actually model and see what it looks like. And you get a sense of like, you know, what it looks like in the urban fabric, you can get like the sense of what shadows it'll cast and things like that. So that's already an existing software that allows you to prospectively model the city going forward with new developments, new buildings. We are the first ones to take that idea and go backwards into history and uncover this using these old Sanborn maps. But that is something that not only people have thought of, but it's actually really possible. People are doing it now.
Let's see. Go ahead, ma'am.
Are the Sanborn map, did the Sanborn company also map other countries, or were they mostly United States insurance company, and are there other companies in other countries that did similar types of mapping?
I don't know much about the rest of the world. I know in North America, Sanborn did work across the United States, but also did Mexico, Cuba, and British Columbia. The only province in Canada that did work was British Columbia. So that's basically the extent of the Sanborn work. However, there are other companies that did similar work in Canada, for example, a Canadian company that produced these fire insurance maps. I also should mention something about the Sanborn maps, is that the Sanborn maps only have data where people could sell fire insurance. So there's some neighborhoods, like for example, some of you may know the American Addition, which is a neighborhood in northeast Columbus. That used to be a separate black settlement outside of Columbus that was not attached to the city in terms of either politically or in terms of infrastructure. It was the first black neighborhood in central Ohio. There's no Sanborn data for it because nobody was worried about fire insurance there in the settlement, so the data doesn't exist. So there are some limitations to the Sanborn data as well. I've heard from colleagues who work with this data that a lot of the cities in the South, you know, historically black neighborhoods, they don't even have Sanborn data for it. So there are some limitations to the Sanborn data. Basically, anywhere they wanted to insure for fire is where Sanborn produced their data.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Based on what you just mentioned, are there any reconstructions of what Black Wall Street used to look like?
Yes. The New York Times has a article where they created a 3D model of the Black Wall Street, Greenwood in Tulsa, actually. And we had a meeting with them, a virtual meeting where they met with us and told us about some of their techniques. But if you go to the New York Times and look up Tulsa, look up Greenwood, you know, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, I think it was in 1921 that there was a race riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Greenwood neighborhood, which is a historically black neighborhood that was called the Black Wall Street in America, was basically burned to the ground and hundreds were killed in a race riot in 1921. But yes, the New York Times actually did that a number of years ago, so if you go to the New York Times, you actually can see their 3D model. Interesting about the conversation with them, they told us that when they were developing this model, we're going to publish it in the New York Times. They noticed that one of the streetcars in their model was incorrect. It was actually a streetcar that was developed in 1924, not 1921. And I said, really? I said, that detail was important? I mean, we're doing science here, and I wouldn't care because the little thing on the streetcar was wrong. And they said, oh, you don't know. We thought that what's going to happen here is that when we create these models, people, if they find any flaw in them, they'll say, oh, this is all made up. So they were that strict in making sure their model was precise down to the individual features of the streetcars to make sure that they were bulletproof in terms of being completely factual. Very high truth standard.
Go ahead in the back, sir. And then Harvey, please repeat the question.
So, two things. One's an observation. Putting something in the windows of these buildings would make it much more lively.
Wait, say that again, sorry?
Putting something in the windows of the buildings would make it much more realistic. I know that's
Okay.
But the question I have is anybody or are you planning to link this to deed and ownership data to help trace why neighborhoods change? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, not directly at this point, but that's definitely a direction we can go. So I should repeat the question, I'm sorry. The first comment was put something in the windows. Well, Well, we can do that, yeah. In some cases, like Poindexter Village, by the way, we have the architectural drawings that we can actually rebuild the interiors of the buildings as well. And then the question was, sorry.
Linking it to deed data.
Oh, yes, sorry.
To link kind of why neighborhoods changed
Right.
on a more fine basis, like what kinds of organizations or people were buying in certain neighborhoods?
Right.
What kinds of people were selling the things that you're seeing? I'm just curious if you link that to any of that matter.
Yeah, we can do that. So the question was whether we can link this to deed data and other types of data to understand how cities changed over time. Yes, actually a lot of the deed and parcel data exists. Here in Columbus, actually, Michael Stinziano, our Franklin County recorder, actually has a GIS operation, so he has historical parcel line database and everything, so we've talked to them several times. There are documents that have every single real estate deed and also real estate listings. These are, again, scanned digital documents, so we have to go to those and try to figure out how we can process and pull the information off that, and then we can link it to our models and eventually do that type of modeling. That's something we're very interested in. We want to look at these fine-grained building by building changes in cities over time and try to understand, not at a broad level how cities change, because we know that, but how did they change at this very fine-grained building by building data over the 19th and 20th centuries. So that is something we do have in mind, yes.
Okay, one last question, the guy all the way in the back.
This also relates to property ownership, specifically along Mount Vernon Avenue. Do we have knowledge that those properties and those buildings, those shops were owned by people who lived in the neighborhood? The reason, one of the reasons I ask about that question is when we look to the future and the changes in the way development is done, are the people in that neighborhood going to be able to afford to own their own properties, commercial properties in those neighborhoods?
Oh, right, so the question was, do we know who owned those buildings on Mount Vernon Avenue? Who owned those businesses, I should say? And then thinking about in the future with things such gentrification, whether or not people will be able to stay in the neighborhood. The first part of the question is, yes, that data is available. We haven't looked at it in detail, but we know that Mount Vernon Avenue used to actually be a Jewish neighborhood, and then eventually transitioned to being a predominantly, historically black neighborhood. So there was that type of transition in the neighborhood. Going forward, and we talk a lot when we do our community outreach work with people in the neighborhood, people are concerned in the neighborhood about gentrification, about being displaced as the inner city neighborhoods in Columbus become more desirable. I mentioned that there was depopulation in this part of Columbus, but there was depopulation everywhere in the center city. I was a student here in the late 80s, and I live in Harrison Park, which is next to Victorian Village. I remember in the 1980s that it was the short north, everything was very depopulated. Very different now. So now we have all these population pressures and gentrification pressures in the center city. And when we talk to people in the neighborhood, they say, they're not necessarily afraid of development occurring. They want development to occur, but they want to be the ones who basically are running it. They want development on their own terms. So things like the grocery gallery opening on Mount Vernon Avenue in early 2026. That's an example of a local entrepreneur who has roots in the neighborhood. I believe your father owned a business that owned that pharmacy, right? And that's the kind of development we want to encourage, and not people from the outside coming out, coming there, building Airbnb, establishing Airbnb, stuff like that, but actually people, with roots in the neighborhood could come back to Mount Vernon Avenue. And that's the kind of development we'd like to see going forward.
Okay, so we'd like to end with a question for you, which is, how would you like to come have a cup of coffee and a cookie and meet the speaker? Let's thank him.
Thank you.